Chances are what you believe now is what you will believe by the end of this section on gun control. The gun debate, like other deeply contested issues, tends to be rooted in presuppositions, and it's unlikely that I will persuade you to shift your stance. Instead, this section is more of an explanation and defense, a manifesto of sorts for gun owners regarding gun control arguments. I want to clarify a few things up front. Respect for life. I am not minimizing the loss of even one life, nor am I making light of any murder, whether it happens during a violent weekend in inner-city Chicago or in a suburban elementary school. Good and honest people exist on both sides of the gun control debate, genuinely trying to end gun violence. The real argument is about the method. I strongly disagree that disarming citizens will prevent murders, and I regard attempts to disarm me as acts of violent aggression. While I believe there are good people advocating for gun control, I also believe they have been grossly misinformed by shoddy research and propaganda. I'm sure they feel the same way about me and those who share my views. Political parties and gun control. When I mention party affiliations like Democrat or Republican, I am not arguing that positions are valid or invalid based solely on party lines. Gun laws have historically had bipartisan support. For example, every gun law signed by Bill Clinton had previously been endorsed by Ronald Reagan. The issue of gun rights has only divided the parties more clearly over the past 30 or so years. Before that, support for gun rights was not tied to any particular political party. Skepticism toward reports and statistics. Not all reports and statistics are created equal. Just because an article is published in a prominent peer-reviewed journal or a statistic is reported on the news does not mean the information is correct or unbiased. This applies to both sides of the gun control debate. Bias and transparency. Gun control is an issue where everyone has an opinion and everyone has a bias one way or another. Denying this would be dishonest. My goal is to clearly explain the gun owner's position and to offer a defense of it while being as honest and transparent as possible. John R. Lott Jr. Throughout this section, I will reference the work of John R. Lott Jr., a name well known in pro-gun circles. Oddly enough, I hadn't read much of Lott before working on this section. Despite hearing about him frequently, often as the primary source of pro-gun statistics, I had my reservations. I was cautious about relying on his work for two main reasons. First, I didn't want to regurgitate inaccurate information, especially after seeing many in the gun community use incorrect data to support their beliefs. Second, anti-gun advocates frequently target Lott, often attacking his credibility and questioning his motives rather than engaging with his research. This further fueled my doubts about his scholarship. So why did I eventually include his work? Because I finally decided to read it? I picked up his book, More Guns, Less Crime, from the library, and within 20 pages, I was on eBay buying every book he had written. I watched all his lectures, interviews, news appearances, and debates. It quickly became clear that Lott is brilliant, and his work is solid. The attacks against him have been either personal or based on assumptions about his motives, not grounded in the quality of his research. His methods are precise, his sources are well documented, and his data sets are expansive, covering thousands of counties across the country. Lott continually updates his research, with much of it freely available on his website, Crime Prevention Research Center, crimeresearch.org. Initially, I included more statistics from Lott's work in this section, but I believe his research is best understood in full. If you're interested in the data, I highly recommend reading his books, as he explains his methods far better than I could. In the pages that follow, I will break down various aspects of the gun control debate, provide explanations, and offer counter-arguments from the perspective of a gun owner who believes that the right to bear arms is a fundamental aspect of American freedom. Pre-20th century arms control. What about common sense sword control? Discussing arms control before the founding of America might seem out of scope, but understanding the historical attempts to control the means of resistance is critical. This section aims to educate gun owners who believe gun control began with the National Firearms Act of 1934 by highlighting that arms control laws existed long before the 20th century. These early laws provide insight into the intentions behind firearm regulation and how the modern interpretation has shifted from its original purpose. Historian Saul Cornell has argued that early American laws demonstrate a tradition of gun control. If you want to explore his perspective, you can follow the link. I do not feel like I can do it justice, and that it really matters in the argument after covering natural law. Registration. Some advocates for modern gun control argue that the founders supported registration, pointing to colonial laws that required men to possess firearms and maintain them in working order. One frequently cited example comes from the public laws of the state of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. However, this is a misleading interpretation. These colonial laws weren't about monitoring or restricting gun ownership. They were about ensuring that citizens were properly equipped to serve in the militia. For example, Rhode Island's law required men to own firearms and ammunition for militia service. The intent was to enforce readiness, not to control or restrict access to arms. In fact, penalties were imposed for not having the required arms, which is the opposite of modern registration efforts intended to track and potentially confiscate firearms. If these firearms were being registered at militia inspections, it also implies that the firearms in question were military-grade weapons, not civilian hunting rifles. This completely contradicts the modern narrative that early Americans only had limited access to arms. It's essential to recognize that these laws were about military readiness, not civilian disarmament. The militia was composed of ordinary citizens who were expected to be armed and ready for service. According to the public laws of Rhode Island, men over 18 were required to possess military-grade equipment, including muskets, bayonets, and ammunition, as part of their civic duty. This version of registration bears no resemblance to modern gun control measures, which often aim to track and regulate civilian firearms for potential confiscation. Early American laws focused on ensuring that citizens were adequately armed for militia service, not on controlling personal gun ownership. Firearm and ammunition storage. Another argument from gun control advocates involves early firearm and ammunition storage laws. Cities did have ordinances regulating the storage of ammunition and firearms, but these laws were based on fire safety concerns rather than an effort to control access to arms. At the time, black powder, which was highly explosive, was commonly used in firearms, and these storage laws were aimed at preventing fires in densely populated areas. For example, Pennsylvania had laws requiring that gunpowder be stored in designated areas to reduce the risk of fire. Similarly, Massachusetts had regulations limiting the amount of gunpowder that could be stored in homes and businesses and requiring excess amounts to be stored in public magazines. These laws were intended to mitigate the danger of fire and explosions, not to restrict firearm ownership. What is particularly revealing about these laws is that they allowed for the public ownership of military-grade weapons like cannons, howitzers, mortars, and even grenades. Citizens were permitted to own such weapons, provided they adhered to safety regulations. This completely undermines the modern gun control argument that the founders did not intend for civilians to own military-style arms. Moreover, early Americans didn't just own military-grade firearms, they also owned privately operated warships. Known as privateers, these privately owned vessels were armed with cannons and used during wartime to disrupt enemy shipping. During the American Revolution and the War of 1812, privateers played a significant role in naval warfare, demonstrating that citizens were not only trusted with military-grade firearms, but with fully equipped warships capable of waging war. These privateers were commissioned by the government through letters of marque, but they were privately owned and operated. This demonstrates that early Americans were trusted with significant firepower, far beyond what is typically considered acceptable for civilian ownership today. The fact that ordinary citizens could own and operate warships bristling with cannons further illustrates the founders' belief in an armed populace as a safeguard against tyranny. The reality of early American gun laws. These storage and registration laws were local ordinances, not federal mandates. They allowed citizens to own and store as much ammunition and weaponry as they wanted, provided they followed fire safety regulations. The focus of these laws was on preventing accidents, not on limiting the people's right to bear arms. Early Americans had access to the same military-grade weapons used by government forces, and they were even allowed to operate privately owned warships during times of war. This completely dismantles the argument that the Second Amendment was meant to limit access to military-style weapons. Instead, the founders clearly envisioned an armed populace capable of defending itself against both foreign threats and domestic tyranny. In summary, early American arms control laws were about ensuring that citizens were prepared for military service and preventing accidents, not about restricting access to weapons. The idea that the founders intended for gun control as we know it today is a gross misinterpretation of their actual intent. Instead, they recognize the importance of an armed populace, not only for personal defense, but for the defense of liberty itself. Stand your ground. Stand your ground laws are frequently brought up in discussions of gun control, especially since the tragic case of Trayvon Martin. However, it's important to clarify that such laws are about the natural right of self-defense, not about reckless behavior. The Trayvon Martin case isn't the focus here, but the debate it sparked illustrates misunderstandings about these laws. If George Zimmerman continued to engage Trayvon Martin after any immediate threat had subsided, that would not be stand your ground. The law does not cover retaliating out of hurt pride. However, if Trayvon was attacking Zimmerman, then Zimmerman had the right to defend himself. As repeatedly emphasized throughout this work, the right to self-defense is a natural right, recognized, not granted, by the Constitution. This right was discussed in depth in Section 1 and has been upheld in various cases, including Bliss versus Commonwealth. Further evidence supporting self-defense as a natural right can be seen in historical laws, often cited by proponents of gun control, such as those on brandishing weapons. These laws actually reinforce the principle of self-defense. It's important to distinguish brandishing from legal open carry. Brandishing is using a weapon to threaten someone without just cause, whereas open carry refers to merely having the weapon visible. Historically, laws against brandishing were meant to regulate threatening behavior, not the act of carrying a weapon itself. For example, in Mississippi, the law defined brandishing as if any person having or carrying any dirk, knife, bowie knife, sword cane, or other deadly weapon shall, in the presence of 3 or more persons, exhibit the same in a rude, angry, and threatening manner, not in necessary self-defense. The statutes of the state of Mississippi of a public and general nature. The idea of self-defense being fundamental extends further back in American history, as dueling was legal in much of the United States until the early 20th century. In the mid-19th century, only half the states had laws against dueling, making the argument that early Americans believed in a duty to retreat untenable. Loyalty oaths. Loyalty oaths have been a long-standing part of American history. Oaths of office are required by the Constitution, and various other loyalty oaths have been required throughout American history, such as during the World Wars. Today, a version of this exists in Form 4473, the paperwork filled out to purchase a firearm, where you are asked if you have renounced your citizenship. This is intended to ensure the buyer isn't a threat to the United States, not just an arbitrary restriction. Historically, loyalty oaths have been tied to firearm confiscation during times of conflict. For instance, during the American Revolution, the Pennsylvania government enacted a law that authorized militia officers to confiscate firearms from individuals who refused to swear allegiance to the new government. The colonel or next officer in command of every battalion of militia in this state is hereby authorized, empowered, and required to collect, receive, and take all the arms in his district or township nearest to such officer, which are in the hands of non-associators, in the most expeditious and effectual manner in his power, and shall give to the owners receipts for such arms. 1776 Powers Laws 11, an ordinance respecting the arms of non-associators. This wasn't a general disarmament, but a wartime measure. Firearms were confiscated from those considered enemies of the state, loyalists, and these weapons were then issued to militia members. The confiscated weapons were documented, and the owners were compensated. If the guns weren't needed, they were returned to their original owners. In contrast, a 1779 Pennsylvania law targeted individuals disloyal to the state's independence, stating, "It is very improper and dangerous that persons disaffected to the liberty and independence of this state shall possess or have in their own keeping any firearms or other weapons used in war, or any gunpowder." 1779 Penal Laws 193. These laws were aimed at disarming potential enemies in a war zone, not disarming the general population. It demonstrates the historical use of gun control as a tool for disarming adversaries during times of war. not for general civilian disarmament. Carrying firearms. Public carry laws, particularly restrictions on carrying concealed firearms, did exist in the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, cities like Tombstone and states like Tennessee and Ohio had regulations against carrying concealed weapons. Each and every person so degrading himself by carrying a dirk, sword cane, French knife, Spanish stiletto, belt or pocket pistols shall pay a fine of $5 for every such offense. The ruling in Nunn versus Georgia clarified that the Second Amendment protected the natural right to self-defense, and that prohibiting the open carry of firearms was unconstitutional. The right of the whole people to keep and bear arms of every description shall not be infringed, curtailed, or broken in upon in the smallest degree. However, the court also held that concealed carry could be restricted under the Second Amendment. Similarly, in Bliss versus Commonwealth, 1822, the court ruled that the right to bear arms had no limits, and any restriction, including on concealed carry, violated the right to self-defense. Civil War. The Civil War era saw significant gun confiscation and other unconstitutional measures, like the suspension of habeas corpus and press censorship. These laws, often cited by gun control advocates, were clear infringements on constitutional rights. The fact that they existed does not justify them, nor does it make them legitimate precedents for modern gun control. Age restrictions. Age restrictions on firearms are also brought up in discussions of early gun control. For example, a law from the 19th century prohibited the sale of gunpowder to minors under 15 without parental approval. However, this law still allowed minors to buy gunpowder if their parents consented. Similarly, a Tennessee law prohibited selling or loaning firearms to minors unless they were for hunting or self-defense. These laws were not strict prohibitions, but rather regulated sales to minors in specific contexts. Summary: pre-20th century arms control. Pre-20th century gun laws varied, but they were primarily city or state regulations rather than federal mandates, making it a stretch to compare them directly to modern gun control laws. The historical narrative favors the gun community, showing that the public had access to military-grade weapons, and even minors could possess firearms for self-defense. The laws from this era confirmed the founders' intent that the right to bear arms included weapons for military use, not just hunting. An example of this can be found in the ownership of artillery pieces, which were available to the public and had no use in hunting. These were legitimate military-grade weapons, further underscoring the founders' belief in an armed populace capable of defending itself and the nation. In 1982, a U.S. Senate subcommittee on the Constitution issued a report titled "The Right to Keep and Bear Arms," which highlighted the early colonial practice of ensuring citizens were armed. The report mentioned that Virginia, as early as 1623, required colonists to be well armed when traveling, and even mandated target practice on Sundays. In Massachusetts, both freemen and indentured servants were required to own firearms, with penalties imposed on those who were not armed. The government even provided firearms to those who couldn't afford them, demonstrating the importance placed on an armed citizenry. The views of prominent figures like William Rawle and Joseph Story further reinforce this understanding. Rawle, writing in 1825, argued that the Second Amendment broadly prohibited disarmament by either federal or state governments, stating that any attempt to do so would be restrained by the amendment. Story later described the right to bear arms as the palladium of the liberties of the Republic, a safeguard against tyranny. This historical context clearly shows that early American laws were aimed at ensuring the populace was armed and ready for defense, and not about disarming citizens. These early laws reveal a consistent intention to maintain a well-armed citizenry, and they stand in stark contrast to the restrictive gun control measures often advocated today.